In this section, we're going to talk about the Taoist tradition. We'll actually divide it into two separate lectures because there are some significant differences between the early tradition and what happens after several centuries. We start seeing it become organized in a slightly different way. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later. What we're going to do in the first part is talk a little bit about the historical context and think about what was going on and what Daoism is a response to, and then we'll take a little closer look at some of the details. So in this first map you can see it's the Western Zhou period. This is right after the Shang dynasty, the one with the oracle bones. And so the Shang have been conquered by another group, the Zhou, and early on they establish a kind of a sort of a feudal system where there's a king, and the king bestows the right to control land and collect the taxes and resources from them on various feudal lords. As you can see in this map, there are no boundaries between the different states because there was a very loose sense of centralized authority, both within the individual states but also within the kingdom as a whole. The king commanded a kind of respect from the feudal lords, but they didn't actually send their taxes directly into him. Maybe they would visit the court periodically, depending on how far they lived away from there, and bring presents and have all kinds of ritual protocols. But the king didn't control the country from the center. Now, if I go on to the second map here, you'll see it's the spring and autumn period. And in the spring and autumn period, the western capital here in Haojing has been lost to invaders, and the various feudal lords didn't come and save the king, which tells you something about where they were in terms of loyalty. And so the capital has moved to the east, so Luoyang over here, and so this period is called the Eastern Zhou. And you can see that the king is here, but that doesn't mean the king is controlling this whole state of Jin. The king really has a small bit of land and is becoming less and less powerful throughout this period. So this is the Eastern Zhou period. And what you see with the other states is that they're becoming not only more defined, but some of them are becoming quite large. And what's happening is that the more powerful states are annexing the smaller, less powerful states. And so we're getting larger and larger states, building up bigger and bigger armies, and the next period after this is called the Warring States period. And as the name implies, once you have a lot of big armies that they're all sort of vying for centralized control of China, that it gets quite messy. And so it's one of the most violent periods in Chinese history. It's several centuries of almost constant warfare. But at the same time, it creates an environment where the best thinkers in China are all trying to solve the same fundamental problem, and that is, why is the world so chaotic? Why is it so violent? And what can we do to fix that, to establish some kind of a peaceful, harmonious socio-political order? Now, in my mind, Confucius is the person that really starts that project. But according to Chinese tradition, it's the founder of Daoism, Laozi, who is supposed to have been Confucius's teacher. And so from that perspective, Daoism comes first, and our textbook follows that approach. So we're starting with Daoism. But let me just briefly say that Confucius is really key, and his understanding of the way to fix the world is really the one that the Taoist thinkers are responding to, at least from the perspective of most Western philosophers on this topic. Just have one quick quotation from Confucius here, and we'll obviously have a whole separate lecture on Confucius, but the Tao of Confucius, the term Tao from Daoism means the way, and Confucius also speaks of the way. But when he talks about the Tao, he's talking about something different than the Taoists. So let's start with his understanding of the Tao, and then we can move on and see what were the Taoists responding to, and what do they mean when they talk about the Tao. So it says, "It is humans that make the way great, not the way that makes humans great. And what that means is that the way, as understood by Confucius, is a human-constructed kind of a road or a path that we determine things like morality. We decide what kind of rules human beings ought to live by. To some extent, it may be a response to natural phenomena. We look up at the order of the heavens and different things on earth and try and pattern human sense of order on the natural order. But it's not a tradition that says that God came down and said, here are the Ten Commandments. This is a path that is established by human beings. And so when it says that humans make the way great, not the way that makes human great, he's saying that human beings create the way, and in some sense we are constantly creating the way. We're thinking about what it means to be human. We're defining the proper way that humans ought to live, moral systems, a sense of propriety. What is the proper way to act as a father or a mother or a son or a daughter or a ruler or a minister or a subject, right? So these are different rules in society, and we all should stick to the ideas that society comes up with how we ought to live, especially when those are defined properly by Confucian sages like Confucius. So that's the Confucian approach. In this quote, he references another way. My explanation for that is that it's only after Daoism becomes a challenge to Confucius that later Confucians will then say, well, this is what Confucius had to say. He had to say that the Confucian way is the real way and that the Taoist way isn't the real way. But to me, that only tells us that this is a later quote, right? This tells us that it's only when we have a Taoist way for Confucius to contrast his way with that he would have any reason for making such a statement. So Confucius, you didn't really say that, sorry. In any case, what is the Tao that it's contrasting with? Not the way that humans make great, but the way that makes humans great. That's the Taoist understanding of Tao. And this quote here is from the Tao Te Ching, attributed to Laozi, a person who, personally, I don't believe was a historical figure. He didn't really exist, but rather we have a collection that was given, attributed to a particular person that's, maybe has some historical roots, but is mostly legendary. And I'll read this passage just to get a sense of what we're talking about with the way. It says, there's a thing shaped by chaos, born prior to heaven and earth, silent and shapeless. It stands alone, unchanged by exterior forces. Its motion is circular and it never tires. It may be regarded as the mother of everything under heaven. I do not know its name, but if forced to, I'll call it Tao. If forced to, I'll call it great. Well, that's not so easy to understand exactly what the author is trying to get at. And this is one of the most difficult texts in the world to read, which is why it's been translated so many different times, because that the classical Chinese that it's written in is very dense and poetic and can be interpreted in a wide variety of ways. But let's just try and get the sense. What is he saying? He's saying somehow there's something called the Tao, and it is the responsible for the creation of the universe. But at the same time, we call it Tao, right? If forced to, I'll call it Tao, but Tao isn't really its name. That's something I want you to grapple with, so I'm not going to tell you exactly what that means here. But I want you to think about that after this part of the lecture. Read carefully this part of the text and think about what exactly is the Tao, and why is it nameless somehow? Why can't we call it by a proper name? And how do we interact with it? So that's something for you to continue to think about. But to give you some kind of clue, you can think about Star Wars. And Star Wars kind of ripped off the Tao for its fundamental idea of the Force. Some of you have undoubtedly seen many episodes of Star Wars. I've got a short snippet here. You can watch it ahead of time if you'd like, but we're going to watch it in class, so if you want to watch it twice, that's fine. Probably most of you have seen it. It's a very famous clip, but it's Luke Skywalker, and he's destroying the Death Star. And I want you to watch it very carefully. I'm not going to give away what we're going to talk about because I want to go through that in class. But somehow it's this idea about how you interact with the Tao and what you need to do in order to connect with the Tao. That's what's really important here, and is of the the fundamental religious value of this whole perspective. So the last clue I'm going to give you, and then we'll take it up in class, is that the central idea is called Wu Wei, and so I've punned it here about the way of Wu Wei. And this particular quote on Wu Wei, there are many in the Tao Te Ching. This particular quote says, "In the pursuit of learning, one knows more every day. In the pursuit of the way, one does less every day. One does less and less until one does nothing at all. And when one does nothing at all, there is nothing that is undone." Nothing that has not been done would be a sort of a more general way to understand that. So I want you to really try and think about what's going on in that passage. But the key idea here is that the typical way that people respond to the world is that they try and add more and more each day. We try and learn more and more and fill our mind with knowledge so we know more and can become more powerful and do more things. And this is taking an opposite direction, right? This is saying those who pursue the Tao, they know less every day. They do less every day. Less and less until they arrive at this ideal state of mind called Wu Wei, non-action or non-purposive action. And from this perspective, that if you can somehow empty yourself out and become kind of blank and empty rather than full, that would be the key to connecting with the Tao. So you can think about all those pieces, and we'll come back in a minute for the second part of the lecture, when we'll look at a more concrete example, which hopefully will help to clarify some of the vague ideas I've been talking about just now.